So we're sitting here on this warm July evening in Germany, and as you can see I have Dr. Rath here with me. We haven't done a great deal of interviews, Dr. Rath, have we, for our video channel, so this seemed like, on such a beautiful evening, a good time to start. To begin with, this is a question that we get many times on our website. Your background, how did you come to be a doctor? What was it that drove you, that led you into medicine in the first place?
Well, my background is very humble. I grew up on a farm, on a produce farm, organic produce farm.
Excellent.
Which at that time was not mainstream. And I remember my father was in the mid-60s. Yeah, I was 10 years old, sitting beside my father in the local pub, and all the farmers attacking him for just being in for the money. And I still remember that moment, a moment of great injustice. And I realized there's something more that you have to fight for when you believe in something.
Right.
And so that's my background. And then my interest in medicine actually was triggered by the misery in the developing world. We, as children, every evening we were praying for the children that were not privileged, and so that must have set my mind. And I was reading books written for young people about how people can help in the developing world, and it stayed with me. And
this came from your father. These ideas about the developing world. And
well, my father was the head of the local YMCA for 20 years, and so he had a way of dealing with young people, not just his own children. And so I think, looking back, he had a strong influence on my life early on. And picking up medicine was then somehow consequential. But again, I couldn't have studied medicine if the path to medical school or to academic life in Germany would not be free for young people who qualify. We couldn't have paid the tuition, etc. So there were a lot of coincidences that came together at that time.
Coincidence and circumstances.
And circumstances, and when I reflect on my time at medical school, I remember that I was organizing courses at the side of the official curriculum for natural therapies like homeopathy or acupuncture.
Right.
Micronutrients were a non-issue at the time. It just didn't exist, not even in the alternative field of medicine.
Right.
And that pretty much summarizes my early path.
So what about the transition from medical school, the orthodoxy, into natural medicine, nutrients medicine, cellular medicine, as we call it now? How did that happen? Was there any opposition as you first charted your course along this direction?
Well, yes, of course. There were a couple of things that come to my mind when you ask me that question. First, I was during medical school. I had a spokesperson for the Medical Student Association in Germany, West Germany at the time. And during that time, we all were engaged and committed in the peace movement. And that's when I first met Linus Pauling at that time. So I was a medical student. I was driving around with a 2-time Nobel Laureate for 4 days, and we were talking, about God and the world, as you can talk as a medical student with a 2-time Nobel Laureate.
You've got to make the most of it while it's there.
I guess so.
Yeah.
And I remember one evening in the city of Bremen, we were having dinner, and Linus said, just like shooting from the hip, he said, "Matthias," this is how I pronounce my name, "Matthias, if you want to be a good doctor, you have to be a good researcher." So that sentence never left me.
Right.
And then the second thing that comes to my mind, answering your question, after I finished medical school, during my residency I was working in the Department of Cardiology in Hamburg Medical School, and there were obviously the teaching professors, they felt I'm doing a good job, and so I should apply with the head of the department for a permanent position, which I did.
Right.
And his first question was, well, weren't you politically active? So I felt privileged to say, yeah, I was, representing the medical students. But at that time in Germany, you were not allowed to say anything to the head of a department that was not along his lines.
Right.
And so there was a short conversation, and he decided that I'm just not suitable for his department. Maybe he was afraid that I would bring in a fresh spirit at that time. So, but that moment I remember as another shaping moment, because I said, okay, that was the last time I'm knocking on the door as a young doctor, asking for something, and I will follow the lines of Linus, and I become a good researcher first, and then I can choose where I go. And so that was another bifurcation in my life, another crossroad, and that led me into the project on cardiovascular research at Hamburg.
Maybe we could talk a bit about that, because this is something that you really haven't written about much in your books. What happened there? I mean, clearly something happened during that period that led you away from that into natural medicine, nutrient medicine.
Well, some of the things I just talked about led the way into that direction. For example, when the head of the research group put me on a new risk factor called Lipoprotein A.
Yes.
It was early on in that gold-digging phase of that little molecule, if I may say.
Yeah.
Every little molecule in research has a gold-digging phase.
A potential profit to be made from it.
Or some reputation to be won for explaining certain aspects of it, etc.
Okay.
It's not necessarily financial, because in academia you're more for the race for reputation, and at my stage of life at that time I just wanted to move on forward.
Sure.
And it was I was feeling the privilege of being on such an interesting little molecule at that moment. And but there was something about this molecule that had escaped other researchers' attention, and that was the fact that there was a connection between lipoprotein a and vitamin C. What they didn't know at the time was that this molecule was found in humans and subhuman primates, chimpanzees, orangutan, etc., but not in lower species. And when I read that fact, I remember that very moment. It was in 2007. Sorry, in 1987, and I recall from the book I had read from Linus on vitamins that wait a minute, isn't this exactly opposite like the vitamin C metabolism? Animals produce their own vitamin C, and they don't produce this risk factor, and humans cannot produce vitamin C, and now suddenly they have this risk factor, which is was or still is the leading risk factor circulating in the bloodstream across the board. And it was that year that I did my first experiments on trying, incubate the lipoprotein A molecule with vitamin C, etc. But it was like picking up a lead and trying to follow and see where it goes.
Sherlock Holmes almost.
A little bit. And then the idea never left me, and I remember even speaking to a Nobel Laureate on that from Dallas, who had won, one of the two who had won the Nobel Prize on the low-density lipoprotein receptor, another aspect of atherosclerosis. And it was on the phone, and he just hung up on me. He said, I don't remember the detailed conversation, but I still remember that he said this is just a coincidence. He didn't want to be bothered by some crazy thought. And
crazy young kid.
And that too. And yeah, and that was the beginning of that path that should change my life. Yeah.
And then, of course, after that, you eventually wound up working with Linus. What was that like?
Well, to start with, the work we had conducted on lipoprotein A was published in 1989 in the world's leading journal on atherosclerosis, which is published by the American Heart Association. And it was worldwide the first time that it became clear that for decades the entire research community had missed the point. They had identified low density lipoprotein, LDL particles inside the plaques in the arteries. Many times there were, I would say, 24 studies on that aspect. But they never checked for that link that made those LDL particles stick, which was, of course, this adhesive tape around the LDL. So that publication made quite some stir, and I was working at the cardiovascular research center in cardiovascular clinic in Berlin at that time, when the publication came out and was torn apart. Should I go on in become a cardiologist, which was my goal at the time, and or should I pick up on that aspect and be part of this research race for the elucidation of this molecule. And in research you have half a year or maybe a year to make up a decision like that, because then the field is gone. others have taken over. So it was not easy, but I think looking back, it was the right decision. So I went through a speaking tour to some research groups in the US in '89 in October, and Houston, Chicago, NIH, La Jolla, and Houston, and they were all interested in lipoprotein little a. But when I brought up my little silent dream, the connection with vitamin C, yes, they all said, "Oh my God, we are not really interested in it." Vitamins were at that time even more outcasted.
Interesting.
Than today.
Interesting.
And this was a 2-week tour that I had planned, and on that weekend in between I went to see Linus, whom I obviously had known before. And he had said, "Well, why don't you come down to my ranch in Big Sur and we'll talk." And so I went down, and I had some papers with me on. And he was beaming because I had basically done what he had told me a couple of years before.
Doing some research.
Yeah, doing some research. And so I told him about this inverse relationship between lipoprotein A and vitamin C. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you know, Matthias, there are 1,000 papers every year on vitamin C. What's really new about that?"
He put you on the spot.
So he put me on the spot, and I said, "Okay, Linus, I think you should read those papers."
Yeah.
And not just mine, but also the others that were leading in that direction. And I'll come back tomorrow. So I stayed at the nearby motel on Highway 1, and still remember this weekend. And the next morning I was driving back to his ranch, and he was already standing there in the doorway and waiting.
Yeah.
And, and he said, "You know, this is you have to go on with this. This is important." And he deserves the credit for having
inspired,
kicked my butt,
right? Better still,
to go on and overcome the frustrations. And you know, you talk to a Nobel Laureate who just received the Nobel Prize, like the gentleman from Houston, and he says this is it's not worth it. You are disappointed. You are, you know, you think, okay, maybe that, and why don't I give up? And so it was extremely important for having another Nobel Laureate
validation,
who said, no, just don't be deterred by that. You need to go on with this. And so that he gets that credit for that moment. And then, of course, when I came back a couple of days later to Berlin, I already found a letter by Linus, which he had written to me. We need to publish this discovery. And of course, there I discovered a trait of Linus. He was he was 89 at that time, and he still had that thrill of
almost
being,
like a boyish enthusiasm.
yeah, being part of a race. And so he had started a little outline of a publication.
Yes.
Vitamin C is lipoprotein A is a surrogate for vitamin C. And Matthias Rath and Linus Pauling, and a couple of sentences, and then some dots, which told me, okay, he made a couple of decisions. First of all, he thinks it's worthwhile to be published, which was for me great. It was just fantastic. Secondly, he put his name there to support it, which was even bigger for me. And thirdly, he suggested to get it published in one of the leading journals of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, where he was a former president of the National Academy of Sciences in the US, and he had lifetime privilege to publish whatever you want. Certain number of papers, but and so that was this moment where I could see that it would put little Matt on the map, in a positive way, and because as I told you, there are a lot of circles in my life, and when they close, there's a synergy, and there's energy being released. And there was another one when I realized, natural health, vitamins, Linus. My work over the last couple of years in the 80s had brought a loop that is so interesting, that this man of science of the 20th century would get excited. I felt that this was a very satisfying moment for me. And of course later his secretary told me that he was writing quite a bit about how happy he is that I joined him, and he told me a year later, he told me that this discovery will later be seen as one of the most important, perhaps the most important discovery in medicine in the 20th century. Sorry, in the second half of the 20th century.
Right, yes.
Little connotation. Of course, in the first part of the 20th century, he made his main discoveries.
Yes.
So wouldn't want to miss those.
No.
But it was a big statement for a man like that.
Sure. And then, of course, in 1992, July, himself and Linus announced the call to eradicate heart disease.
Yeah, that was when I had worked with Linus for more than 2 years by that time, and had written 6 or 7 publications, and I used him as a sparring partner, in quotation mark. These were all new ideas in cardiovascular research, later in cancer, and I wrote them down in draft publications and said, okay, Linus, take it home to your ranch and tell me what you think. And so he came back in most of the cases and said, I'm willing to be a co-author if you want me to, and of course I will. It's a privilege for me. And in heart disease, since you're asking about this call, there were, following this first publication in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, I wrote 2 more papers with very thought-provoking titles. One was called Solution to the Puzzle of Human Cardiovascular Disease. Quite pretentious title, you may say.
It's unusual, yes.
And I remember thinking about that title when driving in the car to my home in where I lived at the time in California, and I said, I'm going to just put it in front of Linus, and if he accepts it, then that's it. And he did. He said, had a little rearrangement of some words, but he supported
he went with it.
that statement, solution to the puzzle of human cardiovascular disease, which meant, okay, that's it. And at that time, you have to recall, it was the heyday of the early years of cholesterol-lowering drugs. The statins had just been becoming mainstream, and everyone was just on that horse, and it was clear that it would be a multi-billion-dollar industry. And here we go and say, well, you can forget about this whole thing, and this is it. We could explain things why humans get atherosclerosis or heart disease and animals don't. We could explain why we get plaques in the arteries and not in the veins. We could explain why we get heart attacks and not nose attacks. We could explain the difference between coronary artery disease and peripheral vascular disease. And it was all like putting so many mosaics together that the picture is clear. And so the title was, in my opinion, not a bit pretentious. It was just so beautiful, laying there. And was it easy for me to forget about mainstream thoughts about cholesterol? And of course not. I was fighting a daily battle. Is it really? Could they be so wrong? Could everything I learned in medical school be so different? And this is what you have to go through. Everyone who goes into pioneering new fields has to go through that phase of battling with your own mind, with your mindset, with the paradigms and with the dogmas. The
orthodoxy, the ideas and beliefs of the orthodoxy.
Absolutely. And so this call that you mentioned in July 1992 was the consequence of having published 3 papers. The third one was called Unified Theory of Human Cardiovascular Disease. And it brought in the evolutionary aspect. I still remember it was when I had written that paper, Linus was already bedridden, and he would die 2 years later. And he was in the hospital, and I brought him this paper, and I said, Linus, this is the last, this completes the picture with the thought that cardiovascular diseases are not a killer number one among Homo sapiens without a reason. There had to be some evolutionary advantage of having the genes that create plaques in the arteries, and of course it was the threat of scurvy during human evolution. Being unable to synthesize vitamin C, it was a constant threat of dying from scurvy. And only those survived who had all kinds of defense mechanisms that during times of nutritional scarcity would come up with some countermeasure. And that was the last missing element of that Mona Lisa cardiovascular disease.
So, I mean,
and just to complete, and this call was the expression of Linus and myself being very confident what we did, and for Linus it was also a gratifying moment, because he had been isolated by conventional medicine, in particular by the medical establishment in the US for the better part of 20 years, and they would fight him in many areas, and he felt that his days were counted, and having such a possibility in seeing that it may actually not have been in vain, maybe even getting some vindication, must have been a great moment, and
I'm sure.
And this call was the expression. We called a press conference, and there's even a little videotape that we did, and it was reported by AP, and some other guys were there. But it was, of course, it was before its time, and we, at the time, it was a fantastic, complete theory, but we hadn't had the time to bring the proof to the table, and hence this call. It was a call for scientific effort to achieve what we just had outlined. It was not to say we did it all and we don't need anyone else. It was quite the contrary.
A call to arms.
A call to arms for those who understand what this possibility is. And yeah, these were very moving times. Those last months with Linus, and he asked me in writing to continue his life work in this field, and he said, you know, Matthias, I don't have anyone else at my institute who could do that.
Right.
And he was lying in his bed at the time, and I said, Linus, you don't have anyone in the world who could do that. And he started, you know, he had tears in his eyes, and it was very moving. You could feel that there was someone who had seen the century, who had fought great battles, not just in science but also in politics, the battle for a nuclear arms ban and stopping the atmospheric nuclear tests, and having his passport taken away from him, and being in front of the McCarthy Senate committee, and all those battles that he had been fighting for, and he said to me also in another conversation, he said, Matthias, the more I observe you, the more I see myself at your age.
Interesting.
And from that, I got a lot of encouragement from this man to go on, and that not just in science, it was the battle for humanitarian values on a larger scale.
I mean, it's clear, just from what you're saying there, that he was a massive influence on you, but also a teacher in a way. You, I guess, must have learned through watching him how he dealt with different situations, perhaps, just based on what you said.
Yes, he could be very entertaining. He was a funny chap. You are out for dinner, and he would just entertain a whole group of people with little jokes and stories. But he was still ambitious at age 90, and I remember when I talked with him about evolutionary aspects, he said to me, Matthias, this has all been solved. I solved it. And my peers from the Caltech Institute in Pasadena, which was one of the leading institutions where he had worked, they agreed with me. So what he didn't say is, who are you, to touch evolution, which is like the Valhalla of science.
Yes.
You know, you have to have a gray beard and basically be on your last stretch in your career when you are allowed to talk about evolution.
Yeah.
So, but it was yes, it was inspirational to work with him, and there was a lot of congruency. One day he took me outside of his ranch in Big Sur, and he said, "Well, Matthias, maybe we could build another house here." And I didn't pay much attention to that sentence. I thought, okay, he's thinking about his children or so.
Right.
It was only later on that I realized that
He's
he was
talking about you.
Well, he was a lonesome man, because he didn't really have much support for the far-sighted concepts that he had in his mind about nutrition and the value for health, and one of the last conversations I had with him was, he said how grateful he is that I came, and I said, Linus, you had been buried alive by the people around you, and he nodded, and that's another price you pay when you are pioneering a field of such magnitude that you may get isolated, even from the people around you, because the arrows flying at you are so many that you are
coming from so many different directions.
Yeah, and you are losing even your closest friends. It's just like climbing a mountain, climbing Mount Everest, and at the beginning you have a lot of people with you, but the last stretch is a very lonesome job, and so Linus, for all the things that historians will write about him, gets the credit of having upheld the flag during those difficult times. He didn't carry the flag through the finishing line, but I hope he looks down on us and listens to this conversation and nods and says, well, at least I passed on the relay in time, so that it goes on. And the same now, we're quarter of a century later, and you, Paul, are around me for 10 years, and I hope that I can be that inspiration to younger people who come to us, even younger than you, and all those, of course, who are listening to this videotape. That's the essence of a good fight, a fight for a good cause. That you are not just doing it for yourself. You have to have a vision. You have to have a little fun in fighting the battle. But above all, it's not about yourself. It is about the future of this planet and of mankind, and of all of you who watch this now, and whom I'm looking now deliberately in your eyes. It's about you, and so I would like to see this conversation that we have in that light,
in that context.
Yes.
It's perhaps a good time. We've talked quite a bit now about cardiovascular disease and the early work with Linus. Maybe we should just move across for a few minutes to the area of cancer, because this being the biggest killer in mankind. 2 years ago, you wrote Victory Over Cancer with Dr. Nitzbicki, which to me, as soon as I saw and read that book, this is the companion to Why Animals, because it sets out very clearly and distinctly how cancer can be controlled naturally.
You mean the book Why Animals Don't Get Heart Attacks?
Yes. To me, as important as that has been in communicating the methodologies for controlling heart disease and related conditions, the Victory Over Cancer book, I already believe, will come to be seen as the same thing. It's equivalent in the area of cancer. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that, how you came to write it, how it came about.
Well, how much time do I have? Let's get started. The starting point for this whole work, again, was the lipoprotein A molecule.
Really? I didn't know that.
In the following way, that the core answer to the question, how come that there is a molecule that suddenly pops up in our species and not in other species, almost becomes the hallmark, metabolic hallmark of Homo sapiens, or at least one important hallmark.
Right.
The answer to that was, it's a repair molecule. And repair in the sense or in the context of a disease is not limited to cardiovascular disease.
Right.
All diseases require repair. All diseases in the human body have something to do with tissue restructuring and repair. And therefore it was not surprising that lipoprotein A molecules were found surrounding cancer processes, and were found surrounding inflammatory processes. Because the job of those molecules, of LPA molecules, was not atherosclerosis or repairing the arteries alone. It was repair of the entire connective tissue, no matter where the problem is. And so I recall once I was starting this process of deducting it from cardiovascular disease and broadening it towards general repair, it was clear to me that the next big disease I had to tackle conceptually at that time was cancer, for obvious reasons, because it still kills every fourth person in the Western world. And so I wrote a paper on the role of lipoprotein A in trying to contain cancer processes. It's called plasmine-induced proteolysis and the role of lipoprotein A. It was published in 1992, and it outlined the role of lipoprotein A in containing cancer processes, and from that fact developed the almost extrapolated the concept. Okay, we know which micronutrients can prevent the deposition of lipoprotein A in the blood vessel wall from the work on cardiovascular disease. So if lipoprotein A is about repair, the same nutritional molecules must actually be doing the job instead of LPA also in cancer.
It makes logical sense, yes.
And so the consequence of this, or the final paragraphs of this paper, were on using lysine and vitamin C and synthetic lysines in an effort to contain cancer. And one of the final paragraphs was if this concept will be scientifically proven one day, this may end cancer and possibly also the control of infectious disease, or at least lead to a great reduction of these health problems. And that, of course, was purely conceptual. There was no experiment at that time, and it was just extrapolating from that work on heart disease. And so it took us from publication date 1992 to 1999, when we had the money for our first institute, when this concept was just out there without a single experiment. And so when we started our own institute in 1999 in Santa Clara, I talked with Dr. Niedzwiecki, and we both agreed. We said, let's go for this one, cancer. We need to prove this one because it's the most challenging, because it was just theoretically developed. And 2 years later, I got a phone call from Dr. Niedzwiecki. You were right. And I said, okay, if we are right with this work, then we need to say it. And so that led to us going to not just to the scientific community in conferences and publications, but also into the broader public. And we went in March 2002. We had a full page, took a full page out in the USA Today, announcing it to the world, saying our research shows that these ingredients, vitamin C, lysine, proline, extracts from green tea by that time had come into the picture, are actually able to inhibit cancer cells from spreading.
So in a way, you were following the same approach you followed with Linus, with the call to eradicate heart disease, going not just to the scientific community, but to the people as well.
Well, I think there's a good reason for that, and that is by that time we were all aware of medicine not being an independent playing field. I had already during the times when I worked with Linus, we had thought, how could we maximize the speed at which this knowledge is being brought to the service of the people. And I went to Basel, to Hoffmann La Roche, the largest manufacturer of vitamin C at that time, and they said, fantastic work, but we're not interested to be your partner, because we would compete with ourselves. We have statins in the pipeline. And so I realized that I was naive, thinking that it is the science that drives the pharmaceutical business. It is the business that drives it, not the science. And they also, the second argument why they did pick it, they said, well, we understand that this would mean that the artery wall is the focus and not cholesterol that circuits in the bloodstream, and we as a company are not willing to pay what they called the perception change that has to precede the marketing.
Right. Yeah.
So that's that, and so then I myself and through mediators contacted overall 16 pharmaceutical companies, and they all said no interest. And then we realized, or I realized, we're on our own, and we had to collect the money first to set up our own research institute, and that took more than half a decade. Hence the delay in going about this research, and that. But it was a necessary process, an eye-opening process those years, because, as you said correctly, it inevitably led to us not relying on the status quo. In fact, strategically recognizing it is a mistake to do that. This message needs to go directly to the people who will immediately understand it, who have an immediate benefit from it, and who will eventually become the supporters of making that reality. And yes, this was no coincidence. This still is a strategic element. If we want to change towards a prevention-oriented healthcare system, we have to speak in a language that is understood by everyone. We have to win the people first, and through the people, the medical profession, and that's how change will occur.
Well, so we've been talking about a lot of things, and what particularly fascinates me is the degree to which change is involved with this. I was wondering, is there, Dr. Rath, a historical analogy that you could bring in here?
Actually, there is. First, meaning 20 years ago when it all started, 23 years ago, I was looking at scientific analogies like the work of Louis Pasteur, ending the era where infectious diseases were thought to be a curse of heaven, by identifying microorganisms as a true cause, and being chastised for it, ignored, ridiculed for just about 25 years, until he vaccinated a young 10-year-old boy against rabies, and that was the moment when everything fell apart from the status quo then. But still, it was 25 years of unnecessary suffering of millions of people from diseases that could obviously be controlled. Then another obvious thought that crossed my mind at the time was the analogy, is the Earth circling the Sun, or is the Sun circling the Earth? In particular, as it relates to the the paradigm battle between, is it cholesterol, is it something that is floating in the bloodstream, or is it the stability of the artery wall that needs to be our focus of attention if we want to control cardiovascular disease? And then I came to realize there is, while there are obvious analogies, the magnitude of the problem of heart disease today is such that it affects every human life.
For sure.
And whether in form of cardiovascular disease itself, heart attacks, strokes, or shortening the life because of the gradual clogging of arteries and thereby shortening lifespan of just about everyone. And so I realized what lies ahead of us today is even bigger than those historical moments that I just described. And it was in early April 1992 that it struck me that the historical analogy to what we're doing today, at the time I should say, what I foresaw what this would be, has to be something that affected or affects every life at a certain time point. And that was the moment when it struck me that the historical parallel to what we are doing today is the turn from medieval times to modern times with the invention of the printing press.
Right.
So we call medieval times the Dark Ages not for nothing. The power of the feudal system, both as it relates to the clerics as well as to the rulers of the land, was based on the illiteracy of the people, the ignorance. Keeping them illiterate was the precondition for the feudal system, for the medieval power structure on, at least in this part of the world. And that changed with the invention of the printing press. Suddenly books did no longer have to be copied by hand, and Latin books were transcribed into the spoken languages, English, German, other languages, were multiplied in a way that can only be described as an explosion. Did the status quo like that? Of course not. We know that they destroyed the printing presses, tried to prevent the change because they didn't want to share power.
They saw what was coming.
They saw it coming, and they knew knowledge is power, and they didn't want to share that power with the people. Did the people bother what the status quo thought? They didn't. Some of them had to pay the price of life for this liberation battle, but in the end there was no army that could stop it. People wanted to be human beings. They didn't want to be just animals on two legs,
of course not.
without the ability to participate in what we know today as human life. And so, in a summary, the analogy to this process that we are involved in, that we are privileged to ferment, in many cases to lead, is the turn from medieval times to modern times. The ability for people to liberate themselves intellectually by learning to read and write, the explosion of knowledge by releasing the intellectual potential, not just of a few privileged, but of entire nations, of millions of people. And at that time, 500 years ago, it was the liberation of the mind. Today we have the liberation of the body, the understanding that diseases are not just a curse of heaven, but they start, most of the diseases we know today start at the level of cells, because the status quo does not reveal, does not want people to know that cells need food. A very basic thought. And that's our liberating moment. We say everyone can take charge of his or her health with that little piece of knowledge. Hence also this term cellular health or cellular medicine. It is that moment of liberation that is in these concepts that will bring about the change at our time. So 500 years ago, liberation of the human mind.
Mm-hmm.
Today, liberation of the human body towards health, or should we say liberation from the scourge of diseases that we know today are largely preventable. Well, you're from Great Britain, Paul, and that's a very good example. Like, your rulers at the time, they had a little feud with the Pope, and so they said, okay, we want our people to pick up this new knowledge, and we want to educate them, and we want to unleash the power of our people, and without really knowing it at the time, what they did is they were creating the precondition for an unprecedented rise in economic, political, scientific power of this little island.
Tiny little island.
To the extent that 2 centuries later they controlled half this planet.
It's astonishing.
And the precondition for this largely unexplained explosion on that little part of our planet to be able to control such a huge territory as
almost without parallel.
I think it is without parallel. That has to do with the release of human potential. And why is that important? It is important because we need to look into the future from now on. Where is this taking us? And as tough as this battle is, and as tough as the attacks are on all of us and by the status quo, the arrows they're shooting at us, and we know that if the time comes that everything we have been working for the last 2 decades is being accepted, and this time is essentially beginning now, we will see a similar unleashing of potential, of human potential, a similar democratization of society by people participating in that central sector of health, characterized also by a humongous release of financial resources.
Absolutely.
If you look at the status quo right now, it holds entire societies hostage through one sector, through controlling healthcare and draining societies through that one sector. And if people at large understand that trick by the pharmaceutical investment business and of course the financial circles behind it, they will no longer play that game, and they will say, well, wait a minute, this is a dead-end road, and we want to change the course.
Okay.
And so it also means that from the field of science, from the field of health, we, not just you and me and the friends that are working with us today, mankind as a whole has to take that step into becoming a political body that changes that. A politically determined movement of liberation, unprecedented in the history of our planet.
Which might be a good moment, perhaps, to start talking about the movement of life, do you think?
Sure.
Because speaking for myself, I know that when I first became aware of this battle, this is going back while I was still a musician, before I met yourself and speaking.
Hey, Paul played with Paul McCartney and others, so he was not just a small-scale musician. He is sometimes too modest about his own past, but
perhaps that's for another day, that talk.
All right.
Yes. So I naively imagined, I think, that it would be possible just to fix, shall we say, the healthcare problem, the vitamin problem, the attempts on vitamin bans problem. And then I think I naively imagined, we're talking 15, maybe 20 years ago, that everything would be okay. But gradually, as I began to learn, and certainly from the moment 10 years ago where I landed in the orbit of yourself and Dr. Mutsviki and began work with you, I very quickly began to realize that, of course, no problem like this, the healthcare problem, can exist in isolation away from the other problems in society. In fact, ultimately, as we know, they all essentially, to all intents and purposes, have the same cause. And I gradually came to realize that even if you were able to fix the healthcare problem temporarily, it would ultimately become polluted by the same interests, shall we say, that have brought about the problems in so many other areas of our lives. So my introduction to the need for a movement of life was, I would say, built on these grounds, the grounds that the simple health activism, shall we say, alone was not enough to do the things and bring about the things that need to be done. Would that be a fair analogy? Would that be a fair analysis? Sorry, would you say?
Sure. In fact, the word analysis is something that that is like a characteristics, or like a branding word for our work. In the sector of health, our analysis is health and disease is not decided at the level of organs. It is decided below at the level of cells. So it's very simple but tremendously analytical move. And as you rightly pointed out, if you translate that drive for correct analysis towards the assessing the political situation where we live today, with a global crisis, economic crisis, unemployment of millions of people, we have to be analytical. Where does this come from? There are debates, the banks, bad people. Well, that's too short. They're all part of it, but the centerpiece is that a group of people has taken this planet hostage, deliberately, strategically, and have masterminded this economic crisis for decades, the build-up of it for decades. And their centerpiece is not energy, even though it is an important element. It is not pollution, even though this is an important element. It is the healthcare sector, because through healthcare they were able to control all other sectors in a way that they promoted their lobbyists into opinion leading positions in medicine, in the media, there's hardly any government in the Western world that would be in power
I don't think so.
that is not being currently in power, that is not being closely connected to these interests. And so once we analyze that, once we understand that there are strategic interests that have defined healthcare, the business with our bodies, as the centerpiece of control for societies, for resources of this planet, for everything. At that moment, you need to take the next step and say, yes, that is deeply political. And therefore, that analysis of healthcare being so tremendously important for the status quo immediately leads us to say, okay, now we got that. Now what to do about it? And that certainly was an important maybe the contributing factor to the launch of the movement of life.
Perhaps since we lost August Kowalczyk last year, maybe it might be right at this moment to say a few words about him and things that he believed in, went through and talked about. Not least of which, of course, was being a co-author of our book on the Nazi roots of the Brussels EU. He's been, I know he's a very good friend to you, Dr. Rath. Maybe we could start sort of from that, how August became involved with the movement of life and how this came about.
Yes, I think we should do that. And let's first talk about August, who he is and how we got to know him.
Yeah.
August Kowalczyk was one of the few survivors of the Auschwitz concentration camp that are still alive at our time. And he managed to escape at age 19 or 20 from the concentration camp of Auschwitz. They were haunted, and he was one of a handful of people who actually managed to escape the concentration camp of Auschwitz. And we met August in 2003. We had a conference in The Hague. It was on the occasion of the Iraq War, and we made a statement that it was this war was against international law, and had a conference on that purpose, pointing out the pharmaceutical, petrochemical interests behind this military escalation of the world at that time. And as part of keeping control and power that we just talked about. And August came to that conference and participated in it. And I remember that everyone in the audience was just taken away, because first we didn't know that survivors of the concentration camps were still with us. And having one of them speak to us about his experiences, it was very moving. And of course the common denominator for August and our work pretty soon became one term, and that term was IG Farben. What is IG Farben? IG Farben is was the largest corporate conglomerate at that time. It was composed of Bayer, BASF, Höchst, and some smaller German chemical companies. And they had put all their forces together into one company in 1925, and they were the financiers of the rise of the Nazis to power. They financed their election campaign. Of course, it was an investment for them, for world conquest.
Of course.
And without going into too many details, they were tried. 24 of the managers of Bayer, BASF, and Höchst were tried in Nuremberg in a separate trial of the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal after World War II. And IG Farben had decided to build its largest corporate plant outside wartime Germany in the small Polish city of Auschwitz. So the reason why Auschwitz today is as what we know it to be was not a racial decision, it was a corporate decision of a large chemical, pharmaceutical conglomerate, petrochemical conglomerate, and the concentration camp was initially a forced labor camp for IG Auschwitz. It became, through that collaboration, was built into a mass extermination camp because so many people were just worked to death in the construction of this camp that they had to build the crematorium and a way to solve this problem of where to bring those people that had served as slave laborers. And August Kowalczyk worked at the construction site of IG Auschwitz, the 100% subsidiary of IG Farben, Bayer, BASF Höchst. He worked there every morning in wooden clocks and just a little shirt and just pants, summer, winter, rain, shine, and he certainly carried a lot of authority on being a witness of history for what corporate interests are capable to do. And that term, IG Farben, in other words, Bayer, BASF, Höchst, then today became the common denominator for our friendship and for the years that we worked together and talked together. Now, going back to Movement of Life, in 2005 we published 40 and later 10,000 pages more, 50,000 altogether, pages of the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal against IG Farben online. After 60 years where this material had been hidden away from mankind.
Gathering dust, is it?
Gathering dust, and you know, imagine how many billions Bayer and BASF must have spent to keep it under the dust. And so we came out with this information. We just shared it to the world, and the survivors of Auschwitz and some other concentration camps, they decided that they should give us what they called their Relay of Life Award in 2007 in November, which was thus far one of the most important honors for the work of our foundation. And on that evening in November 13, 2007, August sat down with Dr. Nitzwicki and myself, and he asked a simple question. He said, "So what are you going to do with this Relay of Life award we gave you?" And I said to him, "August, this is not a gift for us. This is just for our lifetime, something for us to carry and pass it on to the next generation. So what I can commit to you is that we will do everything to invite younger people, the next generation, to learn from what brought us together, to learn from the scientific facts, from the historical facts, from the eye-opening analogies that we created through merging our experiences.
Yes.
And through that enlightenment, help create a movement of life, because the corporations that affected your life so dramatically and that obstruct the acceptance of our work today are the same. And the consequence of this obstruction and this suppression and is death, not just individual death, but genocidal death
For profit.
for profit. $65 million people paid the price of Bayer, BASF, Hoechst trying to conquer the world with their lives. That's World War II. Today, the killing, the dimension of preventable, unnecessary deaths is even bigger. If you imagine every year 16 million people die worldwide of cardiovascular disease, and you extrapolate that for a decade, you have 160 million, and for the last 50 or 60 years, it comes to a billion people or more that pay the price of illiteracy, of being kept stupid about the basic functions of their body with their lives. And that's the message for today. That's the message for the next generation. It's not about Dr. Rath, it's not about Paul, about anybody. It is about us giving our lives to condense this message, pass it on to you, so that you don't have to spend your entire life. You can understand this message in a few hours and take action and change what we were not able to change until now, in a very profound way, in a very principled way, for not just your generation, but for generations to come. That's the transformational time we live in. And movement of life is exactly that. It is a movement carried in particular by young people, and the common denominator is respect for life and the defense of the interests of life towards the interests of disease and death. And we invite you to familiarize yourself more than we can address in this conversation with the goals of what movement of life is.
I guess we should probably add as well that for anybody who has difficulty in appreciating the fact that we have essentially been lied to about the Second World War, how it came about and what caused it. The fact that this was essentially an economic war, a war for profit, bears analogy to today, because we see around us today wars being conducted, wars over resources, over oil and energy resources. People today, I guess, are perhaps a bit more familiar with this concept, but the history of the Second World War has been so cleverly either hidden or written, whichever way you want to look at it, that upon first coming across this information that we've been presenting for a few years now, I can quite appreciate that some people are deeply shocked, because it's an attack on their beliefs, their belief systems, the things that they believe, that they understand and have been taught. So, as Dr. Rath said, we have these tens of thousands of original historical documents online on our Profits of a Life website. We would urge everybody to go and look at them. You can download them and study them for yourselves. Because it's important, this is an important part, isn't it, Dr. Rath, of freeing yourself from the dogma that we have all been brought up to believe in so many different areas of our lives, I guess.
True, and once you do that, you will realize that it was not just the Second World War.
Indeed.
Already World War I was launched by the very same corporate interests. At that time, they didn't use the Nazi Party because it didn't exist at that time. They commissioned the German Emperor Wilhelm II and said, okay, you conquer the world for us. We supply the war materials. BASF had just gotten a patent on making bombs from air. I mean, imagine. They were able to fixate nitrogen from air, and the result was a bomb. And they got a patent on that in 1910. 4 years later, they were able to supply the war machinery for the world's first conquest attempt of the cartel to conquer not just Europe but the world. And
Bayer too.
Bayer, yes, Bayer, BASF supplied the bombs, the nitrogen or ammonium made from nitrogen as the basis for TNT and other explosives. And Bayer was using its chemical knowledge to produce the first chemical agents, mustard gas, that had never been used before as a war tool. So they enabled the German Reich to lead a world war, First World War. And what we need to understand is that the destruction at the end of World War I, 1918, in particular in Europe, was so complete that people were mostly occupied with survival. There were epidemics. There was the so-called Spanish flu. It could have been called the German flu because it was a result of this war that took the lives of another couple of million people just in the aftermath. So people were so occupied with overcoming the hardships of destruction that they forgot to look for the culprits of this war. And the culprits, which are the corporate interests, they said, well, that's exactly what we want. You bother about, and we restructure and make reparations for the next attempt. So that's what they did. And they, ironically, there's so many things we could talk about.
There is indeed.
But there are so really funny ideas they had, in a way, sarcastically, when I'm talking about that, sarcastically funny. They were sending the emperor into exile because they made him the culprit.
Yes.
So they would be protected from anyone asking the question. It cannot be just a little emperor who was conducting this war. But the organization that they created to have all the expertise of world conquest, whether it's political, military, economic, was harbored in a new organization, which they called the Emperor Wilhelm organization. So the guy was sent in exile, but the conquest plan survived in an organization that carried his name. And one of the guys who had a leading role in the economic field of the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, Emperor Wilhelm Society, was Walter Hallstein. And another person was Lise Meitner and Otto Hahn, the guys who, as physicists, developed the nuclear technology. And the head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft that really beats everything was no other than the president of Bayer. So
you couldn't make it
you
up.
couldn't make it up. And behind this scene of a legitimate organization, they prepared the next conquest attempt. And they realized the monarchy was dead.
Mm-hmm.
They had killed it
Mm-hmm.
with commissioning the emperor to start this war.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So they needed a new political force, a radical political force. And along came an unemployed street painter by the name of Adolf Hitler, with crazy ideas, and they built him. They financed the brown shirt movement to destroy democracy in Germany, and they were representing their corporate interests, meaning Bayer, BASF, and Höchst, corporate interests in the late 1920s, were represented in 120 countries in the world. In other words, this was a huge spy organization that designed the plan for the second world conquest. Hitler and his crazy lunatics, he didn't even know where Moscow was, or where, he knew it from the map, but they had no clue where things are, and were never able to draw up the logistics for world conquest. So what happened in 1936 is that the Nazis were in power by then for 3 years. They made it official, and they took the head of BASF, Karl Krauch, or as they called him, Professor Krauch, to come to Berlin and become head of the liaison office. Now, the word liaison office is already a masking word. It was actually the masterminding office for the design of World War II, logistics, which country where there are oil fields, where are the companies that need to be taken over, robbed by the Wehrmacht, and then handed over to IG Farben, and so on and so forth. So that is all detailed in the documents that you referred to, Paul, in Profit Over Life. And obviously we can only touch upon certain aspects, but where you are quite correct, Paul, is in pointing out the dimension of deception that our parents, our grandparents, generations before us,
people who fought in this war,
were subject to. And today again we're faced with the next attempt at world conquest. There's this construct of the Brussels EU that is an undemocratic construct that you cannot vote out of office. And their plans are exactly the same. And the people, the financial circles, the corporate circles that have been building up the Brussels EU over the last half century were German corporate interests led primarily by the very same corporations.
And of course the model that they've used to build this thing, the Brussels EU, is a Nazi model, isn't it? It's in the Nazi blueprints. The Arno Scholte book comes to mind here. They talk about the Commission. The Commission is, as we know it today, the European Commission is described in intimate detail, isn't it? This concept of unelected bureaucrats ruling over Europe.
And that brings us to another point. The history books today, when you're 15, 18 years old, you went through history lessons in school, and certainly you were talking about World War II, and you learned it was basically a racially motivated war of some perverts, Nazis. While that was an aspect, it was the economic incentive for world conquest by the chemical, pharmaceutical, petrochemical industry that was driving that that war. And it is important that we look behind the scenery, that we are able to analyze the past in order to understand the present. If we do not penetrate what is being presented to us, we will not be able to understand the present time, to decipher the language we are bamboozled with. That last year's Nobel Prize was given to the Brussels EU for keeping peace in Europe for 50 years. Well, a closer look shows that the Brussels EU Foundation includes the build-up of a military army to protect the interests of the Brussels EU without any democratic legitimation. And we can see that this old wisdom is very valid today. Those who do not understand the past, they are condemned to relive it.
A little earlier, Dr. Rath, you mentioned in the context of BASF and producing bombs from air, the fact that BASF had taken out a patent, or a patent, as we say in Britain, on this methodology. Perhaps, to close with, in the context of the movement of life, we should explain why our key areas of interest are our key areas of interest and the role that patents play in this.
Yes, of course. The brings us back to this word, the significance of this word analysis. You can go up as a young person who's not just settling for what life offers, who wants to look behind the scene. You can go up against a certain drug, say this drug is bad and we need to inform the world about the side effects. You can go up against a certain company that does criminal things in relation to poisoning the planet as a chemical company. But the deepest level you can reach is if you identify the business model behind an industry. And as we pointed out earlier, the pharmaceutical industry is not a naturally grown industry. It is an investment industry that is living from the invention of synthetic new molecules that have never existed before on this planet, that takes out a patent on these new molecules, which essentially means a piece of paper that assigns this company the right to own this molecule. No one else can own it. And this entire investment business of the pharmaceutical industry is driven by patents. More specifically, if you own this molecule, it means you are the only one who can produce it and who can sell it, and the only one who is entitled on raking in the profits from selling this special molecule. So pharmaceutical companies the world over are in a race to invent ever new synthetic molecules by modifying natural molecules, by inventing completely new structures, and claiming ownership on those molecules for the entire world. What that means is they are not interested in proving what is best for the human body, what is best for preventing a disease, what is best for maintaining health. they are going about their business decisions simply on the basis of what is the substance that we own on the basis of a patent that brings in the biggest profit. That's the ruling principle, not just of one company, of this entire industry. And you may say, well, so, other companies or other industries also take out patents. True, but patents in the area of pharmaceuticals is a different story. For this industry is, by the nature of the game, compelled to invent new molecules that have not existed before, which means when these new molecules are inserted in our bodies, Paul, they are not known by our body, and they're dealt as toxic. So they are, by definition, they are synthetic, or in other words, toxic substances that sooner or later exert their toxicity on the cells of the body. And hence, it is not surprising that more than 40% of the drugs, the pharmaceutical drugs that are currently prescribed to millions of people, paid for by the health insurances, taken by millions of people, are cancerogenic, are known to cause cancer. If you hear that number, you don't believe it, because you think it can't be, because there has to be some regulatory agency preventing that. Yep. Not so, because it is the business model that allows those companies, or compels these companies, to seek ever new synthetic substances unknown to biological systems like our bodies, toxic to them, hence cancerogenic, causing cancer. That is the underlying law for this business. And once you see that, you understand the necessity for us pointing out not just what's wrong with the pharmaceutical industry, but the principle of patenting life. And so when we were defining the scope of the movement of life, Paul, we took this principle. We said we don't want to be another ideologically motivated movement. We want to be a movement that is driven by correct analysis, scientific, economic, historical, and in the case of patents, also legally analytic. The basis for the power of this entire industry is a piece of paper. Now, while I think the principle of patentability in certain areas may be inspiring the development of research, it certainly has the great disadvantage, the unacceptable disadvantage in the area of health, pharmaceuticals, foods, that is unacceptable for humanity to tolerate further. Because if we are not addressing that problem, that the principle of patentability as the basis of entire industries that affect our lives, if we don't address that, we accept this business model. We accept that diseases made by this business, made by man, epidemic proportional diseases, or diseases in epidemic proportions. The side effects of pharmaceutical drugs is the third leading cause of death in the Western world. We accept that that continues, and it's unacceptable. And rather than going up against individual drugs, individual companies, we focus on this principle of patentability, and we say patenting of life, whether this is the health aspect affecting life, whether this is the food aspect, where there is this trend of patenting, modifying food molecules and into this new class of genetically modified organisms, and offering those patented foods as being better than the tomatoes or the plants we've been eating for millennia. or whether it's the patenting of genes for the development of organs or new organisms in total. All of that is against our interests as human beings. It is an infringement of the most basic human rights, and Movement of Life is picking up on that and say all those areas need to be brought to a level of awareness that it hasn't reached until now.
The patenting of food is an interesting one, because I still feel that many people are unaware of the real reason why the companies producing these genetically modified seeds and foods are doing this. They're doing this because the principle that Dr. Rath described earlier about the patenting of unnatural synthetic molecules for drugs also applies to seeds. These companies manipulate the genetic material contained in seeds such that they produce something that didn't exist in nature before, and they can patent it. They own this. So this is the real reason why these companies are so desperate to put these foods onto our dinner plates. It's because they own them. They control them. They can't control natural, organic foods that exist in nature. They didn't invent those, but they can say that they took out patents on these modifications of seeds that didn't previously exist in nature. And this is why they're doing this.
Of course, the Terminator genes come in so that they control the seed business. But maybe we should address that in a separate
I think so.
treehouse talk.
I think so.
But let me ask you a question. You decided to take responsibility in this movement of life, and help to coordinate it, promote it, convey it to the next generation, get young people that are watching us now involved in it. And so let's say I'm 15-year-old and I'm living in Barcelona, and what can I do?
Well, the first step is to educate yourself. This is what we've been doing here today, is try to help this process, to kick-start this process. But after that, it's about educating others. It's not enough to gain education and knowledge for yourself. Once you do that, I feel that we have, it is incumbent on us to share this, what we have learned in these areas of health and food, with others, so that other people can liberate themselves in the same way that we are all doing ourselves. And this is the very basis of the movement of life, a movement of life rather than the principle that has been prevalent for so long amongst the multinational corporations we were talking about, the principle of profit over life, profit before life. For us, it's a movement of life, a movement of the people. This is about the people taking control of their own destiny. If you are 15 years old, in fact my eldest son, Dr. Luke, who of course you've met, is almost 15, he'll be 15 in September. My youngest son, Oliver, is 12. So if you are 15, like my boys, this is your future, this is your planet that we are talking about. And if you care about what sort of a world that you're going to be growing up into, get involved with the movement of life, because this is precisely what it's about.
And I think it is a very practically oriented movement. We will have this library for sure in those key areas of health. What can I do in Barcelona, in Vladivostok, in Cairo, in Buenos Aires, as a young person? What can I do in a developing country where the resources are scarce, in the areas of health, in the area of energy, in the area of food and agriculture, to lead a better life, to take away the power of the status quo over my life, over my future. Take away the perspectivelessness that these interests are spreading over my generation as a young person, and create alternatives at the level where I'm living, and changing my life now, changing the future of my nation and of generations to come. That's our goal, and we invite you to help us to actually be the driving element in this development by communicating with us, by contributing little movies about what projects you are involved in, school projects, community gardening, school gardening, how you collect water, what plants you grow in order to use the ingredients to fight certain health problems. And this is like a clearinghouse, the Movement of Life website, for taking our lives back, each individual life, back from those interests that have taken them largely away from us over the past century, and that will no doubt complete their game plan if we don't fall in their arms to stop them. So Movement of Life, at least in my heart, is something very positive, something that is so out of the right analysis, so timely, and so infectious, positively infectious, that I'm convinced that it will spread in many countries, on all continents, and in the end will make a change for the generations to come.
I think, Dr. Rath, that possibly rounds off a good place to finish this treetop talk, treehouse talk.
Both is possible.
Indeed, indeed. Dr. Rath.
It refers to this beautiful landscape in the back, that we just we enjoy.
So, thank you for listening. Visit our website, Dr. Rath Foundation website, our Facebook page, of course. You'll find lots more videos like this on our YouTube channel. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.